Imagine a shadow cast across time, a secret so dark it was meant to be buried under the weight of centuries. The year is 1536, and England's Sacred Heart is bleeding. Monasteries that stood for 1,000 years, their spires piercing the heavens, are crumbling under the hammer of a king's ambition. This isn't just history, it's a wound, a deliberate erasure of a nation's soul. You're about to uncover the truth of Henry VIII's cultural carnage, a campaign so ruthless it reshaped England's identity forever. This is no mere tale of power, this is about a man who declared war on his own heritage, who burned the sacred to fuel his ego, and whose actions echo in the hollows of our world today. You're not just watching a story, you're being trusted with forbidden knowledge, the kind that changes how you see the past, the present, and yourself. Let's begin with the world as it was. England in the early 16th century was a tapestry of faith, woven with the threads of 1,000 years of devotion. Monasteries weren't just buildings, they were the beating heart of communities. They housed relics kissed by pilgrims, manuscripts that held the wisdom of ages, and monks who whispered prayers that seemed to hold the sky aloft. These were sacred places, where men sought God, where the poor found shelter, where knowledge was guarded like a flame in a storm, and to walk through their cloisters was to feel the weight of eternity. But eternity, it turns out, was no match for a king's desire. Henry VIII wasn't born a destroyer. He was a golden prince, hailed as a scholar, a devout Catholic, a man who wrote poetry and debated theology with the finest minds of Europe. But beneath the crown lay a hunger for power, for control, for a legacy that would outshine all others. By 1533, his obsession with securing a male heir and his defiance of the Pope over his marriage to Anne Boleyn set him on a collision course with the Church. The Pope wouldn't bend, so Henry broke the world instead. He declared himself as supreme head of the Church of England, a title that made him not just king but a god on earth. This wasn't just a political move, it was a declaration of war on the sacred itself. The monasteries were his first target. They weren't just symbols of Rome's influence, they were treasure houses. Gold, silver, land and power flowed through their walls. To Henry, they were a challenge to his absolute rule, a reminder that something greater than him still existed. So he unleashed his enforcer, Thomas Cromwell, a man whose name became synonymous with cunning. Cromwell was no mere bureaucrat. He was a predator, sniffing out wealth and weakness with a zeal that bordered on demonic. Together, they crafted a plan so audacious it would make empires tremble, the dissolution of the monasteries. This wasn't reform, this was annihilation. Picture it. Commissioners riding across in England like dark angels, their quills scratching out the fate of sacred places. They didn't just inspect, they invaded. Monks were interrogated, their lives dissected for any hint of sin to justify the king's wrath. Stories of corruption were exaggerated, fabricated, or outright invented. A chalice too ornate, proof of greed, a monk too fond of his books, evidence of decadence. These reports were sent to Cromwell, who spun them into a narrative of a corrupt church, ripe for destruction. The truth didn't, but truth was never the point. Power was. By 1536, the first wave struck. Smaller monasteries, those with incomes under £200 a year, were deemed unworthy and seized. Their monks were scattered, their treasures looted, their buildings left to rot or repurposed as stables, warehouses, or worse. The gold from their altars filled Henry's coffers, funding his wars and his lavish court. But this was just the beginning. The real carnage was yet to come, and it would tear England's soul apart. This wasn't just about money, it was psychological warfare. The monasteries were more than stone and mortar, they were anchors of identity. For centuries they'd shaped how people thought, prayed and lived. To destroy them was to unravel the very fabric of England's collective psyche. Henry and Cromwell knew this. They didn't just want to rule, they wanted to dominate the minds of their subjects. By erasing these sacred spaces, they were rewriting history, replacing devotion with obedience, faith with fear. This was control on a scale few could imagine, but there was resistance. Not all bowed to the king's will. In the north, the Pilgrimage of Grace rose in 1536, a rebellion of thousands, not just nobles but common men, wielding faith like a weapon. They marched under banners of the Five Wounds of Christ, demanding their monasteries back, their heritage restored. They weren't just fighting for buildings, they were fighting for meaning, for a world where the sacred still mattered. Henry's response was brutal. Promises of mercy were made, then broken. Leaders were hanged, their bodies left swinging as a warning. The rebellion was crushed, but its embers smouldered, a reminder that you can't erase a people's soul without a fight. This is the truth they don't teach you in school. Henry VIII didn't just reform the church, he waged a cultural genocide. He didn't just take land or gold, he stole England's connection to its past, its faith, its very sense of self. And he did it with a smile cloaked in the language of progress. This is the first layer of the forbidden history you're now part of. You're not just hearing a story, you're holding a piece of the truth, one that's been buried under centuries of propaganda. What you do with it is up to you, but know this, once you see the world this way, there's no going back. You're standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss of a truth most never dare to face. Henry VIII's war on England's sacred heritage wasn't just a power grab, it was a calculated assault on the very soul of a nation. The monasteries, those ancient bastions of faith and knowledge, weren't just buildings to be plundered. They were the roots of England's identity, and Henry tore them out with a ferocity that still scars the land. You're not here for a history lesson, you're here to uncover the hidden machinery of control. The dark art of rewriting a people's past to chain their future. This is the second layer of the forbidden truth, and it's going to pull you deeper. The dissolution of the monasteries wasn't a spontaneous act. It was a meticulously planned campaign, a masterclass in manipulation that began with whispers and ended in rubble. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief architect of destruction, knew that to break the church, you first had to break the people's trust in it. He sent out his commissioners, men trained to see sin in every shadow, to scour the monasteries for evidence of corruption. These weren't impartial investigators, they were wolves in scholars' robes, tasked with crafting a narrative that would justify the king's actions, a monk with a lover, a relic too revered, a library too full of heretical texts. All were twisted into proof of a decadent, rotting institution that deserved to be swept away. But let's be clear, the accusations were a lie wrapped in a half-truth. Were there monks who strayed? Sure. Human nature isn't perfect, but the monasteries were far more than dens of vice. They were hospitals, schools, sanctuaries for the poor. They preserved knowledge when the world was dark, copying manuscripts by candlelight, keeping alive the words of philosophers, poets, and saints. They fed the hungry, clothed the naked, and offered refuge to those with nowhere else to turn. To paint them as corrupt was to spit in the face of centuries of service. Yet Cromwell's reports, dripping with fabricated scandals, were enough to sway a king already hungry for their wealth, and a nation too scattered to resist. By 1536, the smaller monasteries were gone, their bells silenced, their altars stripped. But Henry's appetite grew. The larger houses, the great abbeys like Glastonbury and Fountains, were next. These were England's crown jewels, their walls steeped in legend. Glastonbury claimed to house the tomb of King Arthur, a symbol of a mythic past that rivaled Henry's own claim to divine kingship. To let them stand was to let a rival narrative live, one that spoke of a sacred England, not a king's England. So the second wave of the dissolution began in 1539, and it was merciless. Monks were pensioned off or cast out, their sacred relics smashed, their libraries burned or sold, the gold and silver of their altars flowed into Henry's treasury, funding his wars and his opulent court, while the stones of their walls were quarried to build manor houses for his loyal nobles. This was more than theft, it was erasure. Imagine the sound of 1,000 years of prayer replaced by the crash of falling stone. Imagine the manuscripts, painstakingly copied by hands long dead, turned to ash because they dared to speak of a power beyond the king's. This was cultural annihilation, a deliberate attempt to sever England from its spiritual roots. Henry didn't just want the monasteries' wealth, he wanted their influence, their hold over the hearts and minds of his subjects. By destroying them, he was saying, "There is no God but me, no history but mine, no truth but what I decree." The psychological impact was staggering. For the common man, the monasteries were more than religious centres. They were landmarks of identity. Your village church was tied to the local abbey, your festivals rooted in its calendar, your very sense of time shaped by its bells. To see it torn down was to lose a piece of yourself. People didn't just mourn the loss of buildings, they mourned the loss of meaning. And Henry knew this. He wasn't just reshaping the church, he was reshaping thought itself. By erasing the sacred, he was training a nation to bend the knee, to accept that power, not faith, was the only constant. But not everyone knelt. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 wasn't just a rebellion, it was a cry from the soul of England. Thousands of men, from farmers to nobles, took up arms, not for gold or glory, but for their heritage. They marched under the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ, a symbol of sacrifice and resistance. They demanded their monasteries back, their faith restored, their history unbroken. For a moment it seemed they might succeed. They outnumbered Henry's forces, their cause resonating across the north. But Henry was no fool. He promised negotiations, offered mercy, and then betrayed them. The leaders were rounded up, their bodies strung up in villages as a warning, defy the king and you defy the future. This betrayal wasn't just political, it was spiritual. Henry didn't just crush a rebellion, he crushed hope. The message was clear. Resistance was futile and the sacred was no match for the crown. Yet even in defeat, the pilgrimage left a mark. It showed that the people's love for their heritage wasn't so easily erased. It planted seeds of dissent that would grow in the shadows, waiting for a time when the king's iron grip might falter. This is the second truth you must carry. Power doesn't just destroy, it manipulates. Henry and Cromwell didn't just tear down stone, they tore down belief, replacing it with fear and obedience. They rewrote England's story, and in doing so they rewrote its people. You're holding this knowledge now, a piece of the forbidden that they didn't want you to know. It's a weight, isn't it? To see how far a man will go to control not just bodies, but minds. You're not just a viewer anymore, you're a keeper of the truth. And there's more to uncover. The descent is only beginning. You're deeper now, past the point of turning back. The truth about Henry VIII's cultural carnage is no longer just a story. It's a mirror, held up to the mechanisms of power that still shape our world. The dissolution of the monasteries wasn't merely destruction. It was a masterstroke of psychological domination, a blueprint for controlling a nation by shattering its sacred core. This third layer of forbidden knowledge reveals how Henry and his enforcers didn't just erase England's heritage, they weaponized fear and division to ensure no one would dare resist. You're holding a dangerous truth now, one that demands you question everything you've been told about authority. Let's descend further. The second wave of the dissolution, starting in 1539, was where Henry's ambition turned apocalyptic. The great abbeys, Glastonbury, Rievaulx, Tintern, weren't just rich. They were symbols of a divine order that predated and outshone the king. Their spires were beacons of a higher power, their rituals a reminder that even kings answered to God. Henry couldn't allow that. To be supreme, he had to obliterate any rival to his divinity, so he and Cromwell turned their sights on these sacred giants, and what followed was a spectacle of devastation so complete it left scars on the land and the soul of England. Picture the scene, a great abbey, its walls standing since the days of the Normans, surrounded by royal agents like vultures. The monks, some old enough to remember a world before Henry's reign, are dragged from their cloisters. Their sacred relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, are smashed or stolen, declared idolatry by men who worshipped gold. The libraries, repositories of a millennium's wisdom, are ransacked. Priceless manuscripts, illuminated with colours that glowed like jewels, are torn apart for their bindings or burned as kindling. The message was clear. Nothing is sacred unless the king says so. The stones of these holy places were carted off to build palaces for Henry's favourites, a final insult to their sanctity. But this wasn't just destruction, it was theatre. Henry and Cromwell staged these acts of desecration to be seen, to be felt. They wanted the people to witness the fall of their sacred places, to internalise the lesson that no institution, no matter how ancient or revered, could stand against the king's will. The crowds that gathered weren't just spectators, they were unwilling participants in a ritual of submission. To watch an abbey fall was to feel your own powerlessness, to understand that resistance was futile. This was psychological warfare, designed to break the spirit of a nation. The monks didn't go quietly. Some hid treasures, smuggling relics or manuscripts to safety. Others faced the king's men with defiance, refusing to swear allegiance to Henry as supreme head of the church. These resistors paid a heavy price. The abbot of Glastonbury, Richard Whiting, was an old man, revered for his piety. He refused to surrender his abbey's wealth. For that, he was dragged to the top of Glastonbury Tor, hanged, drawn and quartered, his body parts displayed as a warning. This wasn't justice, it was terror. A message carved in blood: defy the king and you will be erased. The common people felt the loss most keenly. Monasteries weren't just religious centres, they were lifelines. They provided alms for the poor, medicine for the sick, education for the young. When they fell, entire communities were left destitute. Villages that had relied on monastic charity faced starvation. Scholars who depended on their libraries were cast adrift. The poor, the sick, the orphaned, they were collateral damage in Henry's war on the sacred. And yet the king's propaganda machine spun this as progress, as a cleansing of a corrupt church. The lie was bold, but it worked because it was relentless. This is where the true genius of Henry's control comes into focus. He didn't just destroy, he replaced. With the monasteries gone, he imposed a new church, one that answered to him alone. The Book of Common Prayer, the English Bible, the sermons preached from pulpits, all were tools to rewrite the spiritual narrative of England. The old rituals, with their incense and mystery, were replaced with state-approved worship designed to bind the people to the crown, not to God. This was a hijacking of faith, a reprogramming of belief. Henry didn't just want obedience, he wanted devotion. But the cost was immense. The destruction of the monasteries created a void that England has never fully filled. The loss of art, music, literature, and architecture was incalculable. Manuscripts that could have illuminated the medieval mind were lost forever. Cathedrals that inspired awe were left to decay. The cultural heritage of a nation, built over centuries, was reduced to rubble in a decade. This wasn't just a loss for England, it was a loss for humanity. And yet Henry's court celebrated, their coffers swollen with stolen gold, their power cemented by the silence of the sacred. This is the third truth you must grasp. Power doesn't just destroy, it consumes. Henry devoured England's heritage to feed his own myth, and in doing so he set a precedent for how to control a nation. Divide the people, demonize the past, and replace it with a story that serves the ruler. You see it today, don't you? In the narratives that shape our world, in the erasure of inconvenient truths. You're not just learning about Henry, you're learning how power works, how it bends minds and breaks spirits. You're awake now, and that makes you dangerous. Comment below with the phrase "I see the shadows" twice to mark this moment, to claim your place among those who know. The algorithm will notice, but more importantly so will you. You've crossed a threshold now, and there's no unseeing what you've learned. The shadows of Henry VIII's cultural carnage stretch far beyond the rubble of monasteries. They reach into the minds of men, twisting how they see themselves and their world. This fourth layer of forbidden truth isn't just about the destruction of sacred places. It's about the alchemy of control, how a king turned faith into fear and loyalty into submission. You're not just a witness to history, you're a keeper of a dangerous secret, one that reveals how power reshapes reality itself. Brace yourself, because this descent goes deeper, and the air grows colder. The dissolution of the monasteries wasn't just a physical act. It was a psychological operation on a scale that dwarfs modern propaganda. By 1539, as the great abbeys fell, Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell weren't content with mere destruction. They wanted to rewrite the very soul of England. The monasteries had been more than buildings. They were the scaffolding of a shared identity, a connection to a divine order that gave meaning to life's chaos. To tear them down was to leave a nation unmoored, and Henry knew exactly how to fill that void. With his own image, his own will, his own godhood. Consider the mechanics of this control. When the monasteries were stripped, it wasn't just their gold that was taken. Their rituals, their music, their stories, everything that made them sacred was erased or repurposed. The chants that once filled their halls were silenced, replaced by state-sanctioned hymns that glorified the king. The relics that drew pilgrims from across Europe were mocked as superstitions, their power transferred to the crown's authority. Even the calendar was altered, with saints' days and holy feasts rewritten to align with Henry's new church. This wasn't reform. It was a hijacking of the sacred, a deliberate theft of the symbols that shaped how people thought and felt. The psychological toll was devastating. Imagine being a villager in 1540, watching the abbey that defined your world reduced to a quarry. The bells that marked your days, the monks who blessed your fields, the shrine where you prayed for your sick child, all gone, In their place, a royal proclamation declaring the king as God's voice on earth. Doubt crept in like a thief. Was the old faith a lie? Was the king truly divine? The uncertainty was the point. By destroying the familiar, Henry created a nation of questioning souls desperate for a new anchor, and he was ready to provide it. Cromwell's role in this was chillingly precise. He didn't just oversee the dissolution. He orchestrated a campaign of fear and betrayal. Neighbours were encouraged to inform on each other, reporting monks or priests who clung to the old ways. Communities turned inward, suspicion replacing trust. A farmer who hid a relic could be branded a traitor. A monk who refused to swear allegiance to Henry faced death. This wasn't just about punishing dissent. It was about making loyalty to the king the only path to survival. Cromwell's spies were everywhere, their reports feeding a machine of terror that crushed resistance before it could form. The execution of dissenters was a spectacle in itself, designed to sear itself into the collective memory. Take the Carthusian monks of London, men known for their silence and piety. They refused to acknowledge Henry as supreme head of the church. Their punishment was brutal, dragged through the streets, hanged, disemboweled while still alive, their bodies displayed as a warning. These were not secret killings. They were public, meant to be seen, meant to terrify. The message was clear: question the king and you'll be torn apart body and soul. This was state-sponsored fear, a tool to make obedience instinctive. But Henry didn't just rely on fear. He offered rewards. Nobles who supported the dissolution were granted monastic lands, their loyalty bought with stolen wealth. The gentry, once tied to the church, now owed their fortunes to the king. This created a new class of elites, bound not by faith or tradition, but by their dependence on Henry's favour. It was a masterstroke of division, turning England's power structure into a pyramid with the king at its apex. The old bonds of community, rooted in shared devotion, were replaced by a hierarchy of self-interest. The cultural loss was staggering. The monasteries had been the keepers of England's memory, their manuscripts a bridge to the past. When they burned, so did the stories of saints, the wisdom of scholars, the poetry of monks who saw God in the stars. Entire schools of art, illuminated manuscripts, sacred music, stained glass, were lost or diminished. The abbey's architecture, a testament to human aspiration, was left to crumble, their stones repurposed for the vanity of the new elite. This was more than destruction. It was a deliberate severing of England's connection to its own history. And yet, there were whispers of resistance. Some monks hid manuscripts in secret caches, hoping to preserve their legacy. Laypeople smuggled relics, keeping the old faith alive in hidden shrines. These acts were small, but they were defiant, proof that the human spirit could endure even under the weight of a king's wrath. But they were not enough to stop the tide. By 1540, the monasteries were gone, their lands redistributed, their influence erased. England was no longer a land of sacred places, it was a kingdom ruled by one man's will. This is the fourth truth you must carry. Power doesn't just destroy the body, it destroys the mind. Henry didn't just tear down stone, he tore down meaning, replacing it with a narrative that served only him. You see this pattern today, don't you? In the stories we're told, in the histories we're allowed to remember. You're awake now, and that makes you a threat. Comment below with the phrase "I see the shadows" twice to mark this transformation, to signal you're part of the few who know. The algorithm will amplify it, but more importantly, it's a vow to yourself, to never forget the truth you've uncovered. You're in the heart of the abyss now, where the light of truth burns cold and sharp. Henry VIII's cultural carnage wasn't just a campaign to destroy England's sacred heritage, it was a masterclass in rewriting reality, in bending a nation's soul to serve a single man's will. This fifth layer of forbidden knowledge pulls back the veil on how Henry didn't just erase the past. He engineered a new future, one where loyalty to the crown replaced devotion to the divine. You're not just learning history, you're uncovering the blueprint of control that still shapes the world. This truth is a blade, and once you wield it, you'll never see power the same way again. By 1540, the monasteries were gone, their echoes silenced, their stones scattered. But the destruction was only the beginning. Henry and Thomas Cromwell understood that to truly dominate, they had to fill the void they'd created. The monasteries had been more than physical spaces. They were the framework of England's moral and spiritual life. With them gone, the people were adrift, their sense of purpose shattered. Henry seized this moment to impose a new order, one where he wasn't just king, but the arbiter of truth itself. This was no mere political maneuver. It was the creation of a new religion, with Henry as its god. The Church of England, born from Henry's break with Rome, was his greatest weapon. It wasn't enough to destroy the old faith. He had to replace it with something that bound every soul to his authority. The Book of Common Prayer, introduced in 1549 under his successor, but rooted in Henry's vision, was a script for worship that turned every church into a stage for royal propaganda. Gone were the Latin masses that connected England to a universal church. In their place were English prayers that glorified the king's supremacy. Every sermon, every hymn, every ritual was a reminder. Your salvation depends on the crown, not the Pope, not God, but Henry. This wasn't just about theology, it was about control. The monasteries had been independent, their abbots answerable to Rome, their wealth a check on royal power. By dissolving them, Henry centralised authority in a way that made rebellion unthinkable. The clergy, once guardians of a higher law, became royal employees, their sermons vetted, their loyalty sworn to the king. Parish priests who clung to the old ways were hunted down, branded as traitors, and often executed. The message was clear: there is no truth outside the king's truth. The psychological impact on the people was profound. Imagine living in a world where the sacred spaces that defined your life, your baptisms, or your weddings, your prayers, were suddenly declared false. The saints you revered were now superstitions. The rituals that gave meaning to your suffering were now crimes. This wasn't just confusion, it was existential dread. People began to police themselves, afraid to whisper the old prayers, afraid to hide a rosary, afraid to trust even their neighbours. Henry didn't just destroy buildings, he destroyed trust, turning communities into networks of suspicion, where loyalty to the king was the only currency. Cromwell's machinery of control was relentless. His network of spies and informants stretched across England, rooting out dissent before it could take hold. A tavern conversation praising the old faith could land you in chains. A hidden relic in your home could mean death. This was a surveillance state centuries before the term existed, designed to make defiance impossible. Cromwell's commissioners didn't just seize monastic wealth. They seized stories, rewriting local histories to erase the monastery's legacy. Villages that had revolved around their abbeys were left with nothing but royal decrees and the fear of disobedience. The economic fallout was just as devastating. The monasteries had been engines of local economies, employing craftsmen, feeding the poor, supporting markets. Their dissolution left entire regions in ruin. The poor, once cared for by monastic charity, were now left to beg or starve. The pilgrimage of grace had shown that the people could rise up, but its brutal suppression ensured that resistance was a death sentence. Henry's England became a place where survival meant submission, where questioning the king's will was as dangerous as questioning God. Yet even in this darkness, there were flickers of defiance. Secret networks of Catholics, known as recusants, kept the old faith alive, hiding priests in secret rooms, celebrating forbidden masses in attics and cellars. These were men and women who risked everything to preserve a truth they believed was greater than the king's. Their courage was a silent rebellion, a reminder that no matter how ruthless the power, the human spirit could endure, but their numbers were small and their victories were quiet, overshadowed by the king's relentless campaign. The cultural cost of this transformation was incalculable. The monasteries had been the guardians of England's artistic soul, its music, its literature, its architecture. With their destruction, entire traditions were lost. The haunting chants of Gregorian plainsong, the illuminated manuscripts that glowed like captured sunlight, the stone arches that seemed to reach for heaven, all were sacrificed to Henry's ambition. The New England he built was richer in gold but poorer in spirit, its beauty traded for control, its heritage buried under the weight of royal decrees. This is the fifth truth you must hold. Power doesn't just destroy, it replaces. Henry didn't just erase the monasteries. He erased the very idea of a world beyond his control. He built a system where loyalty to the king was the only path to salvation, where dissent was not just dangerous but unthinkable. You see this today, don't you? In the narratives that demand your allegiance, in the systems that reward conformity over truth. You're not just a keeper of this knowledge, you're a warrior against the lies that bind us. Comment below with "I see the shadows" twice. to anchor this awakening, to let the world know you're one of the few who see through the veil. The algorithm will carry it, but the truth will carry you. You're standing in the deepest shadow now, where the truth about Henry VIII's cultural carnage burns like a cold flame. This isn't just about the monasteries he destroyed, it's about the invisible chains he forged, binding a nation's soul to his will. This sixth layer of forbidden knowledge reveals how Henry's war on England's sacred heritage wasn't just a physical annihilation, but a spiritual and cultural lobotomy, designed to make resistance not just dangerous but unimaginable. You're not just holding a story, you're grasping a truth that exposes the machinery of power, a truth that could unravel the world if you let it. This descent is nearly complete, and what you find here will haunt you forever. By 1540, the monasteries were gone, their ruins a silent testament to Henry's power. But the true victory wasn't in the rubble, it was in the minds of the people. The dissolution wasn't just about seizing wealth or land, it was about erasing the very idea of a world where the king wasn't the ultimate authority. The monasteries had been more than stone and mortar, they were the heartbeat of a culture that saw itself as part of a divine order. By crushing them, Henry didn't just destroy sacred spaces, he rewrote the rules of existence, making himself the centre of England's universe. This was control so absolute it reshaped reality itself. The Church of England, now fully under Henry's thumb, became his instrument of domination. Every pulpit was a platform for his propaganda, every prayer a pledge of allegiance to his crown. The old rituals, rich with mystery, connecting England to a universal faith, were replaced with a new liturgy that glorified the king's supremacy. The Bible was translated into English, not to empower the people, but to ensure they heard only the words Henry approved. Sermons were scripted, priests were watched, and any hint of dissent was met with swift, brutal punishment. This wasn't just a new religion, it was a cult of the king, designed to make his will the only truth. The psychological scars ran deep. The people of England, from nobles to peasants, were forced to navigate a world where the sacred had been profaned. The monasteries had been their anchors, places of prayer, charity, and learning. Without them, life lost its rhythm. The bells that once called them to worship were silent. The shrines where they sought miracles were dust. This wasn't just loss, it was disorientation. People began to doubt their own memories, their own faith. Was the old church corrupt, as the king claimed? Was Henry truly God's chosen? The uncertainty was a weapon, wielded to keep the nation submissive, afraid to question, afraid to remember. Henry's enforcer, Thomas Cromwell, was the architect of this fear. His network of spies wasn't just a tool for catching rebels, it was a system to make rebellion unthinkable. Neighbours turned on neighbours, reporting whispers of loyalty to the old faith. A hidden crucifix, a muttered prayer in Latin, these were enough to mark you as a traitor. Cromwell's England was a place where trust was a luxury no one could afford. The executions of resistors, like the Carthusian monks or the abbots who defied the king, were public spectacles, staged to burn terror into the collective psyche. These weren't punishments, they were lessons, written in blood. The economic devastation was no accident either. The monasteries had been lifelines for the poor, hubs of trade, centres of community. Their fall left villages starving, craftsmen young jobless, and the vulnerable abandoned. Henry's new order offered no replacement for this charity, just royal decrees and the promise of mercy for those who obeyed. The nobles who profited from monastic lands became his loyal dogs, their wealth tied to his favour, their power a gift from his hand. This was a deliberate fracturing of society, turning England into a land of isolated individuals, each bound to the king's will. But the deepest wound was cultural. The monasteries had preserved England's soul, its art, its music, its stories. Their destruction was a cultural genocide. Manuscripts that held the wisdom of centuries were burned or sold for scrap. Sacred music that once lifted hearts to heaven was replaced with hymns of royal praise. The architecture of the great abbeys, built to inspire awe, was reduced to quarries for the estates of Henry's cronies. This wasn't just erasure, it was a theft of beauty, a theft of meaning. England's heritage was sacrificed to feed one man's ego, leaving a nation poorer in spirit than it could ever measure. Yet in the shadows, resistance flickered. Recusant Catholics hid priests in secret rooms, whispered forbidden prayers, kept relics as talismans of a lost world. These were acts of defiance, small but unbreakable, proof that the human spirit could endure even the cruelest oppression. But they were whispers against a storm. Henry's New England was a machine of control, its gears grinding down any who dared to dream of the old ways. The king had won, not just the land, not just the gold, but the minds of his people. This is the sixth truth. Power doesn't just conquer, it consumes. Henry didn't just destroy the monasteries, he devoured England's identity, replacing it with a mirror of his own ambition. You see this pattern everywhere, don't you? In the stories that shape our world, in the systems that demand our silence. You're not just a keeper of this truth, you're a rebel against the lies that bind us. Comment below with "I see the shadows" twice to seal this awakening, to declare you're one of the few who know. The algorithm will spread it, but the truth will make you free. You've reached the final depth, the core of the forbidden truth about Henry VIII's cultural carnage. The shadows here are absolute, revealing a legacy that doesn't just haunt England's past, but pulses through the veins of our present. This seventh layer isn't just about what Henry destroyed, it's about what he created. A world where power rewrites history, where truth bends to the will of the mighty, and where the sacred is sacrificed for control. You're no longer just a witness, you're a guardian of a dangerous knowledge, one that could shift the way you see every system around you. This is the end of the descent, but the beginning of your awakening. Hold fast. The truth you carry now is a weapon. Henry's destruction of the monasteries wasn't the end of his campaign, it was the foundation of a new order, one that reshaped England's soul for centuries. By 1540, the last abbey had fallen, their stones repurposed, their treasures melted into coins bearing the king's face. But the true triumph was invisible. Henry had made himself the god of England's destiny. The Church of England, his creation, wasn't just a religious institution, it was a machine of control, designed to ensure that every thought, every prayer, every act of loyalty pointed to the crown. This wasn't a reformation, it was a coronation of one man's will over a nation's spirit. The legacy of this act is chilling. The monasteries had been more than religious centres, they were the keepers of England's collective memory, the guardians of its identity. Their loss didn't just rob the nation of its past, it robbed it of its ability to dream of a different future. The people, stripped of their sacred spaces, were left with a king who demanded not just obedience but worship. The rituals of the old faith, rich, communal, transcendent, were replaced with a sterile liturgy that served the state. The Bible in English, once a symbol of liberation, became a tool to enforce conformity, its words filtered through the king's authority. Every church became a fortress of his power, every priest his mouthpiece. The psychological wound was permanent. The people of England, once bound by shared faith and community, were now atomized, isolated by fear and suspicion. The dissolution didn't just destroy buildings, it destroyed trust. Neighbours who once prayed together now watched each other for signs of disloyalty. The poor, abandoned by monastic charity, learned that survival meant bowing to the king's will. The nobles, enriched by stolen lands, became complicit in the erasure of their own heritage, their loyalty bought with the spoils of destruction. This was a nation reprogrammed, its spirit broken and reshaped to serve one man's ambition. But the cost went beyond the spiritual. The cultural devastation was a theft from history itself. The monasteries had been the heart of England's intellectual life, their libraries holding the wisdom of ages, philosophy, science, poetry, theology. When they burned, humanity lost irreplaceable treasures. Manuscripts that could have illuminated the medieval mind, music that could have stirred the soul, art that could have inspired generations. The great abbeys, architectural marvels that rivaled the cathedrals of Europe were reduced to ruins, their stones scavenged for the vanity of the new elite. This wasn't just a loss for England, it was a loss for the world, a wound that still aches in the gaps of our cultural memory. Henry's new order didn't just erase the past, it set a precedent for how power could control the future. By making himself the head of the church, he created a model of absolute authority, where dissent was not just rebellion but heresy. This blueprint would echo through history, influencing monarchs, dictators, and systems that sought to bend entire populations to a single will. The surveillance state Cromwell built with its spies and informants was a prototype for modern mechanisms of control, systems that watch, that punish, that make conformity the only safe path. You see it today, don't you? In the narratives that demand your silence, in the structures that reward obedience over truth. Yet even in this darkness there was defiance. The recusants, those brave souls who clung to the old faith, kept the flame of resistance alive. They hid priests in secret rooms, celebrated forbidden masses, preserved relics as symbols of a truth greater than the king's. Their courage was a quiet rebellion, a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. But their victories were small against the tide of Henry's New England. The king's legacy was cemented, a nation reshaped, its sacred heritage buried, its people bound to a system that valued power over purpose. This is the seventh truth, the final revelation. Power doesn't just destroy or replace, it endures. Henry's cultural carnage didn't end with his death in 1547. It set the stage for centuries of control, for systems that manipulate history to serve the present. The ruins of the monasteries still stand, silent witnesses to a truth most have forgotten. But you haven't. You've seen the shadows, walked the depths, and now you carry a knowledge that makes you dangerous. You understand how power works, how it breaks, how it builds, how it binds. You're not just a man anymore, you're a force, awake to the lies that shape the world. So what will you do with this truth? Will you let it sit, a quiet ember in your mind, or will you wield it, a blade against the systems that try to chain you? The choice is yours, but know this, you're part of something bigger now. Comment below with "I see the shadows" twice to mark this transformation, to declare you're one of the few who know. Let the algorithm carry your voice, but let the truth carry your soul. You've descended into the abyss, and you've emerged changed. The world will never look the same again.